History usually remembers Napoleon Bonaparte as the unstoppable force who marched across Europe like a storm. Kings trembled when his armies approached, generals studied his strategies with awe, and entire nations reorganized themselves around the decisions he made. But there is a strange moment in history that reveals a completely different side of the emperor. It wasn't a battlefield, it wasn't a palace conspiracy, and it certainly wasn't another army that threatened him. Instead, one peaceful afternoon, the most powerful man in Europe found himself surrounded and effectively defeated by rabbits. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally hundreds of them. And for a brief moment something unusual was at stake, not his empire or his army, but something far more personal, his dignity in front of the very officers who followed him into war. The story sounds ridiculous, yet according to historical accounts it really happened. By 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the peak of his influence. Only a few years earlier he had crowned himself Emperor of France, and through a series of breathtaking military campaigns he had defeated several of Europe's most powerful coalitions. His victories were not simply accidents of war. Napoleon possessed an extraordinary mind for strategy, able to read battlefields almost like chessboards and often memorizing complex maps after seeing them only once. He could dictate multiple letters to different secretaries at the same time, sometimes speaking so quickly that they struggled to keep up. Many of his officers believed they were serving under a mind unlike any other. Yet the emperor also had personal traits that people rarely discuss. He was known to sleep very little, sometimes resting only a few hours a night while continuing to work relentlessly. He could be impatient, occasionally explosive in temper, and deeply concerned about discipline and image. He believed that authority depended not only on power but also on perception. The men around him needed to believe he was always in control. In 1807, after months of conflict with Russia, Napoleon signed the historic Treaty of Tilsit with the Russian Emperor, an agreement that temporarily reshaped alliances across Europe and confirmed Napoleon's dominance across much of the continent. For the emperor and his officers, the treaty represented more than diplomacy. It was proof that years of campaigns and sacrifices had produced real power. Victories like this were rare moments when the pressure of command eased slightly. Napoleon's chief of staff, Alexandre Berthier, decided that such a moment deserved celebration. Berthier was known as an extremely organized and loyal officer, a man who handled enormous administrative tasks that kept Napoleon's armies functioning. To honor the emperor and entertain the senior officers, he arranged a grand rabbit hunt. Hunting events were common social traditions among European elites, but they were also subtle political gatherings. During these events generals relaxed, conversations flowed more easily, and loyalty within the leadership circle could be strengthened. Berthier wanted the event to be impressive, so he ordered that a huge number of rabbits be gathered for the hunt. Accounts differ on the exact number, but historians believe somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 rabbits were collected for the occasion. Servants placed the animals into cages around the hunting grounds, preparing them to be released once Napoleon and the officers arrived. The plan was simple and seemed almost foolproof. When the cages were opened, the rabbits would scatter across the fields and the hunters would pursue them across the countryside in an afternoon of sport. Everything about the event was meant to reinforce the emperor's prestige. This celebration existed partly to honor Napoleon, and if it turned awkward or poorly organized, the embarrassment would fall heavily on Berthier himself. Napoleon eventually arrived at the location surrounded by members of his military staff. The atmosphere was relaxed in a way that rarely happened during wartime. Officers spoke freely, some laughing and joking, enjoying a rare break from the tension of campaigns and negotiations. The emperor himself seemed calm, observing the preparations while waiting for the hunt to begin. When the moment came, attendants opened the cages and released the rabbits into the field. At first, hundreds of animals spilled across the grass exactly as expected, hopping through the open area while the hunters watched. But then something unusual began to happen. Instead of spreading outward into the countryside, many of the rabbits began drifting toward the group of hunters. At first it seemed random, perhaps just a few animals wandering in the wrong direction. Then more followed. Within moments dozens of rabbits were hopping directly toward Napoleon and his officers. The generals looked at each other with mild confusion. This was not how a hunt normally unfolded, but the situation still seemed harmless enough. Then the movement intensified. The rabbits were no longer wandering. They were advancing. Hundreds of them began running toward the emperor in a thick wave of fur and movement. They crowded around boots and uniforms, brushing against legs and pushing between the officers standing in the field. Napoleon reportedly tried to drive them away using his riding crop, waving it downward and attempting to push the animals back. But the more he tried to force them away, the more rabbits seemed to appear from behind the first wave. Suddenly the situation carried consequences no one had expected. The man who had commanded massive armies and faced artillery fire without hesitation was now being surrounded by animals small enough to fit under a chair. And they kept coming. The field filled with rabbits pressing closer around Napoleon and the surrounding officers. The longer the emperor remained standing there, the greater the risk that the moment would spiral into complete embarrassment in front of the very generals who respected him as Europe's most powerful commander. With the rabbits pressing in and attendants struggling to control the chaos, Napoleon did the only practical thing left. He turned and moved quickly toward his carriage while servants rushed forward trying to clear a path through the swarm. Arms waved, animals scattered, and the emperor climbed into the carriage as attendants pushed the rabbits away from the wheels. Only then did the pressure finally break. The animals gradually dispersed as the attendants regained control of the area, but the carefully planned hunt was already ruined. What was meant to be a triumphant celebration had collapsed into confusion and absurdity. As the officers tried to understand what had just happened, the explanation slowly emerged. The rabbits that Berthier had gathered were not wild rabbits at all. They were domesticated animals raised around humans. Wild rabbits would have scattered immediately when the cages opened, running away from the hunters in fear. Domesticated rabbits behaved differently. They were used to seeing humans as the source of food. When hundreds of them were released and saw a large group of people standing in the field, they did not interpret the scene as danger. Instead, they rushed toward the humans expecting to be fed. The emperor and his officers had unknowingly become the center of what the rabbits believed was feeding time. For Napoleon, it was an ironic situation. He had spent years outmaneuvering enemy armies, surviving assassination attempts, and commanding soldiers across vast battlefields. Yet on that particular afternoon the one enemy he could not defeat was a crowd of hungry rabbits that simply thought he had brought them lunch.